I just need to minimize this application. It's didn't plan for blocking everything. Okay, so my name is Jake Bowkett. I'm a programmer and artist based in Australia. I started as a background artist for visual novels several years ago, and I still am occasionally. I'm doing a commission right now. Um, and I'm also the sole developer of this site called StoryDevs, which is a site for visual novel developers to find each other more efficiently, hopefully, than the current methods available. So, oh, and I also just wanted to sort of note that I also got funding similar to what Kuiper said, and I sort of second everything he just said. So there's also that. So, yeah, I'm going to be talking about logo design. I've sort of written design process here because it's a bit more generally applicable than just logo design, but that's what I'll be using as an example. I'll be sort of introspecting on my own process using the StoryDevs graphics as an example. So, and despite it sort of being about a website logo, it's still adaptable to visual novels. I also just want to say this isn't graphic design 101, so there will be a few of the more simple concepts that I skip over. So I'm using Photoshop as a, slide presentation thing, but whatever. So a good logo should be easy to read, should scale well, should work in grayscale, and it should also be relevant. These points, I won't be covering them linearly. I'll instead be chipping away at them over the course of the talk, and hopefully at the end it'll become apparent what I mean by all of these things. So, the logo appears in a lot of places. I'm not going to read all of these, but it's just sort of to emphasize just how many places it can appear, and it's very important because it's your first impression. It's the first thing people see usually. So, before you start designing a logo, you sort of really need to know the goals for the thing you're making, whether it's a visual novel, website, whatever. And my goal for StoryDevs, I probably shared this a bit too early. My goal for StoryDevs was to not limit the audience, to bring people in who don't usually make visual novels or perhaps don't even know what they are, and to call attention to underrepresented people and also perhaps titles or whatever. So the goal of StoryDevs is essentially, or the goal for the logo anyway, is essentially to represent diversity, but not just of identity, which we usually think of when we say diversity, but also subject matter. So what does it look like visually to represent diversity? Well, one way to look at it is to sort of see when it fails, or when I'm asserting that it has failed. And I sort of think if you look at these, all these sites that are ostensibly general purpose visual novel sites, services, tools, and so on, they have very similar elements to them, you might notice. And this is fine, but people self-select based on what they see, their first impression of the thing. They'll self-select very quickly. And they won't tell you when they self-select. They won't say, I'm not, they might see anime girls and they just sort of get turned off immediately, even though they might like visual novels. So people are self-selecting based on a subject matter, anime girls, rather than the actual art form, which is visual novels, which they may like. And, Ren'Py, for example, is a totally general purpose visual novel tool, and you can make anything with it. It doesn't have to have cute girls in it or whatever. And you're sort of always limiting an audience. An audience is always limited, actually. You just want to make sure you're not unnecessarily limiting your audience. So, and I just included this to sort of say that the very conference we're speaking at also sort of does this. And again, just want to reiterate, that's not like a criticism or anything. It's totally legitimate to do that. It's just we need to be aware of the way people sort of self-select. Anyway, so this is sort of the brainstorming phase for the logo that I went through. I started right here, and I was trying to think what's intrinsic to visual novels, what's something I can choose that doesn't limit the audience. Well, the development methods we use are all sort of common between us. We all have to write, we all have to program, we all have to write music, and we all have to, draw, paint, whatever. So I decided to focus on that. There's no sort of presumption about the types of things that are legitimate to create. And it's all tools we all use. So the first idea has nice ideas within it, but it's very messy and hard to understand. It looks, you have no idea where to start. It's got this divider thing in there, otherwise it's way too messy, and that divider just adds a lot of visual clutter without adding any sort of meaning or whatever. Sometimes your first idea is really good. Sometimes it's not. This is okay, this is actually workable, and I end up iterating on just this idea. Sometimes you want to come up with 2 or 3, 4 or 5 different ideas and then choose the best ones out of that. That's not what I did in this case. I just iterated. So with number 2, I just sort of got a bit of a block from number 1. I didn't know how to, I knew I wanted to include these development methods or tools or whatever, but I didn't know how to. So I decided to focus on the text. I knew I wanted it to be iconic even when it's by itself. So perhaps it's just appearing in, a black and white document or whatever, and I don't want to put these icons in there or whatever. So a normal word, even with a nice font, usually isn't very recognizable. So I played with the positioning and the size, and I've ended up superscripting devs here. I put it in a sans serif font because it's much easier to read that way. If you have serifs on it, it's much more busy and it's hard to read at a smaller size. And just as a sort of aside, superscripting like this sort of makes it look like a power in math. And so you could read the design as story to the power of devs, which sounds incredibly cheesy, but it's useful to be aware of these different ways that your design can be read, because they won't always be favorable to your message like that. Like I just said, it's very cheesy, but it doesn't contradict the message. So that's good. With number 3, it's starting to look better. I reintroduced the icons, and I put them in a straight line so that the design can be sort of read left to right. The icons have flat, simple colors, and they're evenly spaced across the spectrum. I originally went with red, yellow, blue, and green, but it sort of looked a bit bland, like playground colors or something. So I ended up shifting them a bit. And with number 4, I've changed 2 of the icons. The overlap pages here, can't really see them very clearly. I'm going to regret doing this. Okay, so they're just supposed to represent the process of editing and writing. And it's a good idea. I like the idea. But it's not very clear, especially at a small size. So I replaced it with this page with the folded corner on it. That sort of iconography is already very popular. Every time you create a new document, it's always got this sort of thing here. Lost my place. Okay, so I also changed the musical staff and lines to musical notes because, same reason, it's just too busy over here. And I also switched the positions of the paintbrush, which is here, with the command prompt, in case you don't know what that is. A lot of people, it turns out, didn't know what that was. And the reason I did that is because among visual novel developers and the audience, there's an implicit hierarchy of development skills, which is sort of writing, art, music, programming. Not everyone agrees on that, but that's usually the most common one I see said. And I don't agree with that, but I recognize it as a powerful idea. And so I'm sort of reinforcing this idea with the order of the icons. We read left to right in Western writing anyway. And in Western writing, there's an implicit hierarchy in things. Things that appear first are generally considered more important. You have a topic sentence for a paragraph, and that paragraph might belong to a heading, and so on and so forth. So it reads left to right, and generally the most important things are on the left, and then so on and so forth. Yeah, and it's just less jarring to read because it's reinforcing your expectations. So that was my initial brainstorming session. In this specific case, I sort of just iterated on an idea that was already okay, as I said, and then I made more incremental changes from here. So first thing I did was change this command prompt icon to computer monitor. The reason I did that is, as I said before, many people didn't know what the command prompt looked like. It's just this. I forgot I'm only sharing Photoshop. Okay, my bad. So many people didn't know what the command prompt was. even developers, some developers didn't know. That's bad. You really want developers to know what it is, considering it's a site for developers. Yeah, I sort of gave up representing programming with a icon. It's very hard to do that. So the screen at least provides more context for story. It sort of indicates that story is, it's going to be a digital story. And that sort of implies programming, because you're going to need some sort of programming to get the digital story to display on your screen. It's a bit weak still, but, it's better than nothing. I also changed the folded corner, the page with the folded corner to a speech bubble. The reason I did this is it's sort of jumping ahead a bit, but the logo as a whole is very landscape oriented, and it doesn't work in cases where you need square, a square version of it, like in a Twitter avatar or as a browser tab icon. And remember, this is a website logo, so it needs to work in a browser tab icon. So what do you do in that case? Well, one thing you could do is just take one of the icons, the most important icon. Remember the hierarchy of writing, art, music, and programming. So you take the most important icon and you use it as a stand-in for all the logo. So if you do that and you put it in the browser tab icon, what happens is, if a page fails to load in Chrome, it actually looks like this. So that's not good. One of our the stand-in for our entire logo looks the equivalent to failure. That's pretty bad. So when I realized that, I actually, where is it? And then I changed it to the speech bubble thing. The speech bubble also has some other nice properties. It represents more things. You can represent, I've got a list here somewhere. You can represent things like networking, marketing, team intercommunication, voice acting, maybe even translation. And it sort of can be projected on. It doesn't contradict any of those meanings. The visual design also has rounded corners, and in general, talking seen as less formal than writing, and maybe that's attractive to people, and so on. So after that, there was some smaller tweaks, such as, I've left that on. Okay, smaller tweaks. The first thing I did was render a huge version of it. The other versions you might have noticed were a bit rough, whereas this one's much more refined. And you do want a very large version because you don't know when it's going to be used. Maybe people want to use it in print on a giant banner, and you'll need a very high resolution version of it for that. So one of the adjustments I made was in saturation and value. You notice the one at the bottom is much more even in brightness. All these icons sort of are more even, and they're a bit more brighter as well. And when I say value, I just mean brightness. They're essentially the same thing. So generally speaking, yellows need to be quite a bit fairly bright compared to other colors so that they'll be read as yellow. Otherwise, if they're a bit too dark, they would look like more like a brown. And I didn't want sort of dull colors in my design. I wanted to convey energy and enthusiasm. And so that's sort of why I did that adjustment. The value adjustments also balance the focus of the logo. As I said, we usually read left to right, top to bottom, but we can be convinced to look elsewhere by things like huge headings, high contrast or movement. In this case, I'll show you how the values just look by themselves. Here we can see at the top, they're quite uneven. This paintbrush in particular is fairly dark compared to, say, the monitor, which is the brightest icon here. And as I just said, contrast can redirect your attention. So the designer reads left to right, but now we've got like this monitor at the side, like at the very end, sort of very bright and drawing attention to itself, and we don't want that. So I evened out the values across here to sort of fix that. Another thing that happens is that if you might not be able to tell, but these values are not exactly even still. I left them a bit uneven. The reason for that is because sometimes if you make the values equivalent for different colors, they will look brighter than each other or darker than each other, even though they aren't in value. And I don't know exactly why this happens, but I'm going to show you this anyway. You can sort of see the brightness of the yellow sort of falls off constantly, sort of very evenly falling off, whether it's over here where it's very saturated or over here where it's very desaturated. With a blue, it takes a lot longer for the darkness to disappear and for it to be perceived as brighter. And even still, the brightest blue is not as bright as the brightest yellow. So even values, you can fudge it a bit. Then I made a dedicated grayscale version. And by dedicated, I mean I've actually made all the values of the entire logo this time uniform. It's still usable when it's inverted, so that's good. And the cases where you will use this logo is as a watermark, for example, or when it's in black and white print. If you use a color logo in situations like black and white print, it doesn't look as nice. It also doesn't look intentional. It looks like you screwed up or you weren't aware that it was going to be printed in color. And the sharp black and white version looks much more professional. So the base logo looks sort of nice. I consider this the base logo of Story Devs, even though I don't actually use it anywhere. I don't use it on any public account or in any sort of promotional material. But I use it to construct all of my other designs. So this looks nice. We still need a browser tab icon. As I said before, the one we were using didn't work. We could use perhaps this speech bubble here. But that's the way I did it first. So I'm trying to figure out the square design. I'm like, well, what can I do? I'm going to carve up this design somehow. As I said, I'm using it as a base logo, and then I'm sort of extracting elements from it and seeing, how I can recombine them. So the first thing I did was just, put these in a square. It doesn't look very nice. One of the reasons it doesn't look nice is the kerning is all off with these icons. I guess I could vertically kern them or something. I don't know. If you zoom in here, you'll notice that the paintbrush, if you draw a vertical line here, the paintbrush and the speech bubble are quite close. Paintbrush and the notes are quite close. The screen is actually quite far away from here. So that's what I'm talking about when I say kerning, distance between different elements. But it's sort of screwy here. It's not clear where to put it. I sort of wanted the speech bubble and the paintbrush aligned vertically, but then the speech bubble and the musical note have too big a gap between them. It just looks very awful. So that sucked. And it definitely can't be a browser tab icon. It's too detailed. If you made this 16 pixels by 16 pixels, you wouldn't be able to tell what's going on. And it's also not apparent where to start looking. I just keep attacking this design. I'm going to move on. So next I just tried the most important icon, the writing icon. This has the same sort of problem when you shrink it down. It's too small. You can't tell what's going on. The squiggles here look like, it just looks bad. It also sort of looks like, I don't know, a Yahoo Answers logo or something. That's what it makes me think of. And same problem with this. It's very illegible at a small size. And question mark, or speech bubbles rather, are very, they're very common for Q&A sites. And I didn't want my site to be confused with that in a browser tab situation, for lack of a better word. So yeah, I didn't know what to do at this stage. Just ignore this icon here. We'll get back to that. I didn't know what to do. So I'm going to switch what I'm sharing. Screen. Okay, that's working. So I didn't know what to do at that stage. So I just switched to making the Twitter banner. I said, okay, I can't figure out what to make the avatar, so I'll just try something else. And I just added these stripes here on a whim because this design here looked all right. It looked very empty here. And I just thought, I don't know, I guess I'll just draw some lines here. And it ended up looking pretty cool. So I made it the banner. And then I thought, well, now I've got this new design element to play with. Why don't I just try making this the icon? It's very, very simple. It doesn't need to be red. It's not like text. And it's not representing anything. They have no intrinsic meaning. So it doesn't matter if it gets very small. Yeah, as you can see up the top here, it is very small. And now I've lost my train of thought because I can't see my notes. Um, so we'll switch back to Photoshop. Actually, no, we won't. Yeah, so as I said, they don't really mean anything, but they usually appear in a context where you can see them with the other icons or the text or whatever. So it's very rare that these stripes appear by themselves. I can't actually think of a case where they do. It's almost always directly next to the name, so that's fine. And the color pattern is also repeating the icon's color pattern in the same order. Again, that hierarchy being reinforced from left to right. Switching back to my notes. Yeah. Okay, so you might also want to consider how they're animated. If you plan on doing any sort of animation with it, like how are you going to do that, or should you do that? And these stripes, it's very fortunate that that they are as they are, because they're just so simple that you can do anything with them. It's not complicated to animate in the way the rest of the logo would be. Like, it's not even clear how you'd animate the rest of the logo. But these stripes, very simple. And, there's a loading animation, blah, 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 blah. Also, I might as well talk about this now that I'm here. This banner, I've left the stripes out. The reason I did that is because, the stripes are already up here, and if you have them reappearing here, they're not going to be as thin as these stripes up here, so they're going to be thicker, and they're not going to align properly with these stripes up here. It's going to look weird and bad. So yeah, I think that's all I had to say. So, designing a community service site is different than, for a piece of art like a visual novel or a game or whatever. That sort of stuff is more focused and exclusive. Sort of the same thing that Kuiper was saying earlier, actually. You don't want to try to appeal to absolutely everyone. But in this case, it's sort of a valid case for trying to appeal to much more people than a typical game or visual novel would be. And, it's going to be different for you. So, many of these points are generally applicable. It's not just for logos. It can be for, anything design related. Yeah, and, they appear many places, blah, 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 blah. So let's just go back and sort of restate those original points. Where are they? Here. Your logo should be easy to read, should scale well, should work in grayscale, and it should be relevant. So that's it, I think. I'll just show this again. Make it, big. There's my Twitter handle. There's my StoryDevs handle. And thanks.
That was awesome. If anything, you've just shown me how important having a designer is.
Thank you.
Right. So we got some questions. Some quick ones. Like someone's asking what software you use for the animation.
None. Or I'm using CSS and HTML to get this animation effect. I can sort of show you the code right now if you want to see it.
Oh wow, canvas draws and all that. Cool.
So let's see. It would be on page. A bunch of stuff. You can animate in CSS using this keyframes thing. I don't know what it's called. And there's just a bunch of empty elements that are shaped like stripes, and then they will have their own delay on the animation. They just use the same animation. And yeah, CSS takes care of most of the hard stuff for you. It's a bit annoying to program though. And I should probably be looking at the Discord actually.
All right. Okay. If there's any bit more questions, someone asked what text editor you were using.
Just then I was using WebStorm, which is by JetBrains.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. And so that's about it for time.